Hi, welcome back to a brand new snippet from The President and the Cockroach. Uh, Today we're going to start the first part of Chapter 3, which is called The Wimp of the Flies. I think you'll figure it out as we go along. Just a short commercial interruption. In the comments section underneath this video, you'll be able to see a link that will take you directly to Amazon.com, where you can purchase a copy in Kindle format or paperback of The President and the Cockroach, so that you can read it at your leisure, for your pleasure. That's all the Dr. Seuss rhymes that I have with that. But if you're ready, let's begin. The Wimp of the Flies. The really great thing about living at the end of the line was that Sarah could always get a seat for a ride into work. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, when she was usually pretty beat, Sarah usually had to stand, hanging on a chrome bar for at least half of her ride home. Life sucks, then you die, she thought grimly, as the metro disappeared beneath the earth into the tunnels that allowed the commuter trains access to the capital city. Roscoe Murrow lived in the opposite direction from Sarah, but he took the metro to the end of the line too. When the train stopped at Branch Avenue, Rosie found his car in a big lot and drove another half an hour south to the little Mennonite tomato farm in Hughesville, where he rented a room above a workshop in the barn. Mr. Fisher, his given name was Christian, but Roscoe had never heard anyone call him anything but Mr. Fisher or the Mister, owned the prosperous little farm helped by his wife, Polly Byler, his daughter Charming, and his son Jacob. The Fisher family, now that they had gotten to know Roscoe, were friendly, but Roscoe was English. The Fisher family and Roscoe each led their own lives. The only member of the family who would ever talk to Roscoe was the Mister, and the Mister's knowledge of English wasn't very extensive. Roscoe had learned after the first year that in nearly any circumstance it was best to just nod his head to anything that was said by anyone Amish and say, "Nayo." Once a year or so, 50 or 60 of the Fisher family cousins would come to the farmstead along with Oma and Opa. Whenever these gatherings occurred, Roscoe was always included and was always well fed, but after 30 minutes or so, the cousins would give up trying to speak English anymore and revert to the Low German they spoke among themselves. Roscoe had learned that when a story ended, everyone would laugh, and he could then smile, nod, and say, "Nayo." The part of these get-togethers that Roscoe liked best was when the cousins would make music. Hammered dulcimers, violas, guitars, mandolins, and harmonicas would be brought out to accompany truly jaw-dropping singing, sometimes a cappella. Roscoe had taken up the guitar so that he would not feel completely out of place. He was nowhere near to being in the Cousins League, but everyone seemed very happy that Roscoe had made the effort and never played loudly enough to screw things up. The Mister and his son wore black slacks, suspenders, blue-buttoned work shirts, and well-polished but scuffed black work boots. The Mister was clean-shaven, and his son was too young to shave yet. Polly Byler and her daughter wore gaily purple cape dresses. Instead of an apron covering the entire front of the skirt of the dress, pieces of dark blue fabric were attached to the dress's shoulders. Neither wore a shawl. That was for old order women. Since there was no apron for modesty, the women and girls wore slips under their skirts and snapped the dresses up the backs. They covered their heads with little white caps and wore black bonnets when they went out into the English world. Roscoe enjoyed living on the farm with the Fisher family. It offered all that he could want: a quiet country life, friendly but not demandingly sociable neighbors, and the feeling that he was living in a mysterious foreign land, all close to work and the American amenities he found that he could not do without. The next morning, Roscoe got up, got dressed, and drove his car to the metro station, stopping on the way to pick up a fast food burrito and a carton of orange juice. At just about the same time, Sarah left her apartment and walked to the metro, stopping by Sands on the way to pick up a tortilla filled with huevos rancheros and a little cup of coffee. They arrived at the CCNC building within 10 minutes of each other, planned their filming of the daily briefing, and decided on what questions they would ask if they were called upon. Neither one had yet ever been called to ask a question at a briefing. At 10:30, they left the CCNC offices to walk over to the White House for the briefing. When the presser began, Scott Arskog walked out from behind the velvet curtains that hid the hallway that led from the offices of the West Wing to the room where the journalists gathered to wait for their slim chance to ask a single question that could ignite their careers. Welcome, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Scott began. Today is a very auspicious day here at the White House. Today is Junior Journalist Day. Yes, today is the day that the President has chosen to invite tomorrow's future scribes and reporters to their very first press conference. These young people of today will be the ones asking the questions that I hope I have the skill and experience to answer. Scott simpered and hid his mouth behind a hand, giggling at his little joke. What the hell? Sarah exclaimed and looked toward Rosie, who stood to her left, the big digital camera on his shoulder focusing on Scott's mouth. Did you hear that? Sarah asked. There was a mumbled rumbling that washed through the room, courtesy of the old, experienced journalist, and excited, high-pitched giggling from the junior journalists. Scott began. Our first question today will be from Exochitl Garcia, a fourth grader from Western Upper Marlboro Elementary School. The pretty little girl with the long dark braids and the official green vest, white shirt, and khaki pants that identified her as a junior Girl Scout stepped up to the microphone, adjusted it so that it was pointed at her mouth instead of at her forehead, and said in a soft, steady soprano, "Excuse me, sir, my name is pronounced Soshi. My question is, what does the President think is the most important job people can do in the America?" Scott Arskog took a few seconds, cleared his throat, and told her, "Little lady, the President believes that in moving forward and that every time we think outside the box and work smarter, not harder, we make our great country an even better place to live. Thank you." Scott smiled and looked down at his notes on the podium for the name of the next questioner. Our next young newsman is Trayvon Terrell, who's in 5th grade at the Suitland Silver Hill Charter School. Trayvon, what is your question? Trayvon looked at his own notes for a minute and spent a minute getting his courage up. Then his question rushed out of his mouth, each word hurrying to be the first to the listener's ears. "Mr. Arskog, if I was standing by the President, I would ask him what his favorite food is." This was a question that Scott had prepared for. "Well, young man, I believe that I can weigh in on that. I have eaten with the President many times, and I can say that President Beans is an uber fan of bacon." Thank you. Scott looked at his notes again and said, "Our next future correspondent is Miss Diamond Jones, a 6th grader at Cardozo Middle School, right here in Washington, D.C. Miss Jones?" Diamond Jones had just had her question inadvertently stolen from her by Trayvon Terrell, but Miss Jones was quick and probably smarter than Scott and most of his family put together, so she simply smiled and said, "I love bacon too. Could the President make bacon the national food of America?" Thank you. Scott Arskog had to think for a minute about that one. He was just a simple spokesman, and he had missed Sesame Street the day that they had explained how a bill becomes a law, but he forged ahead anyway. That is an excellent question. I'm sure that President Beans would like to do that and supports every American's right to make an individual choice. At the end of the day, making a food official might have unintended consequences, but I'm sure that President Beans supports you in this noble endeavor. Note to self, I will run this by the President, but if the Democrat Party would be willing to cooperate, I'm sure that it could be a done deal. Sarah turned to Rosie and whispered, "This is terrible. Thank God CCNC is paying us for this." Roscoe whispered back, "I've been filming, focused on Scott's face. Maybe we'll get some usable video out of this farce." Sarah patted him on the back. Scott called on the next young person. "And now Miss Ananda Lal, grade 5 from the Siva Vishnu Day School in Lanham, Maryland." Ananda Lal, a chubby girl with a winning smile, large shining brown eyes, and long dark hair covered by a light blue headscarf, wore shalwar kameez of loose white trousers and a periwinkle blue tunic, and stepped up to the microphone to ask her question. "What is it like to be president? I know that it must be hard work, but how does it feel?" Scott thought for a minute and said, "It is a great honor and a great responsibility for our president to move the needle for all of us every day and be able to reach out to the American people when he has a full plate on his desk every day." And then he called the next wannabe scribe, Miss Caitlin Hutchinson, from the kindergarten class at Old Oak Elementary School. A tiny platinum blonde girl with her hair escaping from the braids that had been tied with red ribbons that didn't quite match the red in her plaid jumper jumped up to the microphone. She began to ask her question, but she was too short for the microphone. Trayvon Terrell got up from his seat to adjust it for her. Her sweet, high-pitched "thank you" boomed out through the room. Trayvon smirked and Caitlin laughed and began, "Do you like rainbows or unicorns? Do you like red or blue? Do you have a pony? Do you like animals? Do you like giraffes? Do you like elephants? Do you like apples?" Scott was flummoxed at this little girl's enthusiastically cheerful interrogation, but he was the face of the president, and so he soldiered on. I'm sure that I can weigh in on that. I mean, I believe that I can speak for the president when I say yes, yes, no. I mean, yes, 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 and yes. Caitlin Hutchinson grinned from ear to ear and skipped back to take her seat in the second row. Now let's hear from Brett Bradley, who's being homeschooled in Annapolis, Maryland. Mr. Bradley. Brett's mother took his hand and led the little boy, dressed in a blue blazer, clip-on rep tie, light blue button-down shirt, and gray pants. He held his mother's hand like it was a lifeline, and he might drown. He might have been 5 years old. His mother lifted him up and held him on her hips so that he could speak into the microphone. He was very shy. But after his mother had whispered into his ear for a couple of minutes, Master Brett Bradley spoke slowly and carefully into the mic. "Why is your face on the penny?" he asked. Scott wasn't exactly sure how to answer this question, so he chose the better part of valor, thanked the boy, and then called on the next news person, Sequoia Rogers, a second grader from Virginia. The young Mr. Rogers walked up to the microphone and got right to business. "How do you control the United States?" he asked with a serious frown. Scott thought about this for a minute and gave the only answer he could think of, very carefully. The adult journalist laughed, and the junior journalist looked confused. Scott felt relieved that he escaped that bullet, and little Mr. Sequoia Rogers rocked back to his seat, wondering what that had meant. Scott looked at his notes, found that the next child was the final one to the presser, and introduced Santiago Lopez, a kindergartner from the district. I would ask the president about bedtime," Santiago said. "I am a free man." Scott Arskog replied, "It is what it is. It's all good." And then he was able to conclude. "I would like to thank our young journalists of tomorrow for their insightful questions and remind the older correspondents that our next briefing is scheduled for tomorrow at 11 o'clock sharp, just after recess." Scott was the only one laughing in the room. "See you then." And the president's spokesman walked off the little stage behind the heavy curtains and back to his office somewhere in the west wing of the White House. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked Roscoe. Roscoe laughed quietly and shook his head. "Just another day in an alternate paradise, Sarah. Just another day."